Good evening, everyone, and welcome to In the Adirondack Library. I'm David Kahn, Executive Director of the Adirondack Experience. There is, of course, an actual Adirondack Library here at the Adirondack Experience. It houses the largest and most comprehensive repository of books, manuscripts, maps, and other materials relating to the history of the Adirondacks. Our program series, however, is a sort of virtual Adirondack Library. It's intended to promote wonderful new books that have been published about our region. These books are available via the Adirondack Experience's online store and at your local library. We hope you'll read them all for yourself. Our interviewer tonight and throughout our series is the renowned gentleman and scholar Mitch Teich, otherwise known as the station manager of North Country Public Radio. He's also the host of North Words. North Words is offered on the fourth Friday of each month on NCPR in the 12 to 1 p.m. time slot. The weekly podcast features interviews, on-site recordings, and special features that remind us what makes the North Country a special and unique place to be. It is my very great pleasure to introduce to you tonight's author, Dr. Alice Paden Green, who grew up in the Adirondacks during the 1950s and 1960s. She holds a doctorate in criminal justice and master's degrees in education, social work, and criminology. She's the executive director of the Center for Law and Justice, an Albany-based civil rights organization she founded in 1985. The organization provides community education on civil and criminal justice, legal guidance and advocacy, crisis intervention, and community planning and organizing around criminal justice and both civil rights and civil liberties issues of particular concern to poor communities and those of color. In 1997, Dr. Green founded and is now president of the Paden Institute and Retreat for Writers of Color, located in the Adirondack town of Essex. There, writers are provided with technical assistance and a free environment for writing. Dr. Green is also a member of the board of directors of the New York State Defenders Association, vice president of Senior Hope, an alcohol and drug counseling program, an advisory board member for the Capital District chapter of the NYCLU, and a founder of the African American Cultural Center of the Capital Region. I should also mention that the Adirondack Experience is in the process of developing a permanent exhibit on the history of African Americans in the Adirondacks, and Dr. Green has kindly agreed to serve as an advisor to that project. In addition to all her other work, for over 20 years, Dr. Green worked as a prison volunteer. Dr. Green has co-authored multiple books, including 1999's Law Never Here and Wicked Albany, published in 2009, and she authored tonight's featured title, Outsider, Stories of Growing Up Black in the Adirondacks. In just a moment, I'll turn things over to Dr. Green. She'll provide an overview of her book, and following that, she'll answer questions from Mitch and you, the audience. We welcome your participation. Please submit your questions at any time during the program through the Q&A feature. And also check the chat for important links. And with that, I'll turn things over to Dr. Green.
Oh, well, thank you. This is very special, and I'm very excited to talk about my book and to talk about my life in the Adirondacks. And I would like to give just a little brief mention of some of the ancestors that I feel very grateful to have had in my life, because they had a lot of influence on what I do. I always mention that that I'm one of the few people who has a great grandmother that I actually had some contact with when I was an infant. She was born enslaved in South Carolina. And then I had a grandmother, maternal grandmother, who was a sharecropper. And I sort of feel like I've sort of, embodied some of the major oppressive forces in this country. And I was lucky that my father, who was part of Jim Crow South, decided that he wanted to go north so that he could do better in his life. And so he did that because in I think in the 1920s, it was then, well, it became Republic Steel Corporation, but there was a need for Black workers. Had been a strike, and also immigration was down. So my dad and his brother uh, ended up in Lion Mountain area. Um, my uncle stayed there, but my father decided to go back south, and after a short period of time decided that he really needed to go back north because he felt a little bit better, because he feared the convict leasing system at a time when uh, both Black men and some women and even children were basically picked up off the street, uh, taken into the criminal justice system, either through fines or uh, uh, sentencing. And it was very dangerous at that particular time because you didn't really have to commit any crime. It's just that you were picked up so that you could provide free labor to businesses in that area. So he came north uh, to first after his brother had decided to stay, and my father returned. He came back to the area of uh, Witherby and Port Henry. And it was interesting it's interesting to note that in Port Henry, there were maybe about 12 or 13 Black families who got there in, the same way that my dad did, working in the mines. And most of them came from the same area, Greenville, South Carolina. So, but they were all basically put in housing that was owned by the Republic Steel Corporation in one particular area, and that was Port Henry. So, but it was about 6 miles from Witherby, and we had no or limited transportation. So I never really saw them. So my family grew up, brothers and sisters grew up in Witherby, which at that time I think maybe had 2 or 3,000 people in it. They were all basically white. Um, and so we got introduced into a white community that was also Catholic. And if you weren't either one of those, you were in trouble. It was definitely a very uh, 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 a community that basically had a lot of different ethnic groups. But as I said, they figured out how to work together. But one person told me recently that it was, even though it was diverse, when someone of color came into the area, they were seen as outsiders. So from the very beginning, my family, who migrated during that great migration period, were seen as outsiders. And so that sort of set the stage for what my book talks about is what was that experience like? What impact did it have on me and my family? Uh, and so I talk about that. I also talk about Fort Henry because I thought that was a good example of a segregated community in a small area, in a small section of the Adirondacks. As I said, they lived pretty much together on the same street. And so it was not, it was rare that you would see someone living in a different part of Fort Henry because they're basically confined to that area. But in Witherby, as I said, it was a different story. I never had contact with any other people of color. Um, it was very easy to see what was happening after a while in Witherby. And I wanted to write this book because I think people need to understand what white supremacy looks like. It's not necessarily those people in robes, Ku Klux Klan, and all of that. It's in our communities. And also, it's in communities that where people believe that whites are superior and anybody else is inferior. And so I've grown up with that thinking all my life. Everyone was socialized to believe in white supremacy. I was as well. My whole family was, uh, because that's what you came in contact with, whether it was in school, employment, uh, whatever, social life. Um, Everything was sort of organized in a way that told you that something is wrong with you, because you're different. And so the book talks a lot about how we had to struggle with that and some of the problems that came up as a result of it. So I try to include a lot of different things, like adolescence, what it was like growing up in a community where people think you're different and inferior. Inferior is really the key point here. Um, and so you have to understand that we don't see this today in terms of how it played out in the lives of people. So what I wanted to do, and this book is more than about me. It's about this whole problem of our history in terms of how this country basically dehumanized Africans. Uh, and it's still with us. And a lot of people won't acknowledge it. They don't know the history. So I've been focusing on that and trying to get people to understand that because I finally learned that I was not inferior, uh, but we still in this country believe that Black people are inferior. So that sort of laid out what I had to do as a member of the community. I had to make sure that I did things that uh, demonstrate to people that I really wasn't inferior. Education was one of them. So I excelled at school, and graduated, eventually graduated top of my class. So that was, one thing I had to do. Um, I talk about um, love relationships and how difficult that was, because when you live in a segregated racist society, certain things are not allowed. And so that has an impact. And I want basically people to understand the impact, not only to know what white supremacy looks like, but I want them to have some idea of how it feels. And I'm really pushing these days to get people to not only learn about the history, but to see some of the things that happened to Black people and to feel, for them. And that's the only way I think that we're going to be able to really have an equal society. But if you look at me and say you're Black and therefore something is different about you, so you're inferior, you're never going to reach that equity that we strive for. So I talk about that. I also talk about some of the ways that racism did play out in my life and the impact it had on me, and also other members of my family. I talk about some of the good people that were in my life in this small town, and there were some. Thank goodness that helped me get through. Some of them were teachers, and others were people connected with the church community. I point out one of the terrible ways that we were discriminated against in employment, not only me, but my brothers, and what that meant. Um, I talk about friendships. There were some friendships that developed, which I'm so thankful for. Um, and I look at also the role that poverty played in my life, because we were poor and in a rural community, and being poor in a rural community very different than being poor in a city. In a rural community, it can be much rougher. I also talk a lot about my family. I'm just so delighted that I had parents who were, um, willing to do anything and everything to make life uh, better for their children. And so I think about them every day. I'm just feel so lucky and fortunate that I was able to have a mother and a father like the ones that I have. And then a lot of it is just about struggles and how do you deal with people in a community that does not that sees you as an outsider. You know, um, that unfortunately, uh, people aren't always honest with you, and so that made it very difficult for me to trust white people. Um, because they might, appear nice at one point and friendly, but behind their doors, they think of you very differently. And for instance, I have one story about slip of the tongue and how people that I respected and thought they were happy with our relationship, they ended up using the N word when that would slip out of their mouths at certain times, and they would apologize, but it destroyed me to know that I couldn't trust people. And so, I just want people to start seeing Black people and to understand the impact that all of this racism and white supremacy, poverty, and everything has on an individual. I want people to feel, and that's a tall order because it's not something that we actually do in this country and in this environment. We talk about things, and we use data to explain a lot of stuff, but don't really feel. And so that's what I've been doing, as I said, lately. Um, uh, the whole experience was painful, but also there were parts of it that were good. And I feel like I really, um, I took whatever I could get from that environment, and I've made it in the sense that I think I've come out okay. I like me now. I didn't like me before because I was told that I was in every way. The movies told me that I was inferior, and so that was hard to deal with. Uh, but luckily, I came along in an era when there was, uh, people talking about Black is beautiful, Black power, and all of that. That was helpful to me because I embraced it and said, yes, that's me. Uh, and as I said, now I'm pretty proud of who I am. And I look back at the struggles and the people that, came along the way, and um, I'm okay. And that's the important thing.
Well, Mitch Tyke here, and I'm so glad you're feeling okay because it's been an honor to read this memoir and get to be witness to bear witness to everything that you've been through. And we've already had some very nice questions come up. Um, in fact, I'll read a couple. You have a hello long time ago friend from Steve Stoffolano Jr. who says you are more than okay. Megan Perez says you are beautiful and adds feeling it for someone is the next level. Thank you for sharing your full perspective and experience. Um, and we have a somewhat more involved question, and then I have a number of questions, but I do want to encourage people to contribute your questions using the Q&A function. You should see a little box at the bottom of your Zoom screen that says Q&A, and feel free to type your question in there. We can also take questions. Some people are using the chat as well, and the questions are popping up faster than I can read them. So let me start with this one from Nell Painter, who says, "Thank you so much, Dr. Green, for your book and the valuable information you impart about Black people in the Adirondacks." She says, "I'm writing to you from outside Elizabethtown to ask about your main title referring to being an outsider. I certainly understand how you would feel treated as an outsider in the very place you grew up. But I wonder, though, if you spent time in South Carolina, where your family was from, and if you felt less of an outsider there."
I was little. I was young. I didn't. I have some memories of the South, but you know, I I don't have that. I don't have memories, that many memories. So in terms of being treated, I didn't know any white people, uh, and race for me at that time wasn't real. Um, but yeah, so my experience, I tell everybody I'm from the Adirondacks because that's what I remember and experienced, but not the South.
I thinking about when you sat down to write this book, was it an emotional experience for you to revisit those stories of what it was like to grow up in the Adirondacks as they existed in your younger days?
Yeah, it was very difficult for me to do this. I wasn't planning on writing this book, I'm going to tell you. Because as I said before, I didn't really trust people, and I never let them into my personal life because I didn't trust them because of the experiences I had. And so I never thought that I would ever share uh, that information with anybody. But then I became convinced that it was important for people who are now dealing with this issue, and people, especially in the Adirondacks, who are talking about, diversity and all of these things. Uh, I want them to know what the impact of living in that kind of an environment really was. So I think it helps them when they're talking about issues like diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's more than just a few words. It's you got to understand that it has an impact. I'm thinking about the entire history of Africans and African Americans in this country. Um, we sort of write off things like enslavement. Oh yeah, enslavement that ended in 1865. So therefore, why is everybody talking about race and all of these things? You know, the impact not only of enslavement, but everything that followed, all the oppression that followed, including what I mentioned before, the convict leasing system, uh, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, uh, now mass incarceration. All those things get handed down, and it impacts your life and your thoughts and your feelings. And so I want people to feel, as I said, I want people to feel what I felt. And I think that's the only way that people are going to be motivated to the point that they would take action, real action, not things. Sometimes we do a lot of things that I consider distractions because they're not dealing with the harm that was done to Africans in this country.
You write this really telling anecdote in your book about, and maybe it was one of the catalysts that got you to write it in the first place, about running into someone at a reunion, I think it was, and sharing, this person shared their experience of growing up in Witherby, and said to you that it was such a wonderful place, there was no racism and everybody was open with each other. It must be difficult to run into people who lived in the area at that time and be wondering all the time about how they viewed their black classmates or their black neighbors.
Mhm. Yeah, and I've done that, like we've had reunions and other meetings in the area, and people are shocked when they said, "What do you mean that you had a difficult time in the Adirondacks? We knew you." Yeah, everybody was friendly to me in school. I mean, school was for me was a was a refuge because uh, I had some good teachers, uh, and of course people were nice to me. I I was president of the freshman class, I think. I was treasurer of another class. But once you walked out of the door of the school, it was a whole different world. Uh, you were not accepted socially as an equal person. I never got invited to, things like the white friends, like to family weddings or uh, any kind of social uh, events. It just didn't happen. And you weren't allowed to talk to white boys. And they certainly weren't allowed to talk to you. Not that they wanted to, but it was forbidden. And so for me, it was a whole different world uh, after I got, as I said, when I left the schoolhouse door. But I've run into a number of people over the years who are, you know, uh, some of them seem angry. How can you say things like that about Witherby? Because we don't know of anything that happened there that was, uh, that was destructive or harmful to you. But they didn't know what was happening. Like for instance, with my brothers, when my brothers became older, and they wanted to date girls. It was my brother, my beautiful brother Ralph, was a great athlete. Both of my brothers were athletes, but Ralph was so popular, people just loved him. As a matter of fact, he was voted to be I think it was a junior prom king, and he couldn't get a date. Nobody would go to the prom with him. And, and he resented that so much. It stayed with him, you know, and some of these other incidents stay with me. They don't disappear. So in 1865, yeah, we got rid of chattel slavery, but you didn't get rid of the impact of it all uh, on African people.
I thought it was very telling that you could be the president of the drama club but not be allowed to act in any of the performances.
Exactly. I mean, things like that, and for me, it left a terrible impact and the pain in me because I really wanted to I really wanted to act. That was one. I mean, I was a movie buff. I spent a lot of time in the movies. Um, Even though when I think back, the movies that I saw was so demeaning, but I wanted to act. That had it within me. I don't know why, but I had no outlet for it, and so that was one of the things that you know even angered me to this day.
Yeah, I can imagine. We have a number of other questions already. Anthony Antonucci has several good questions. The first of them is he writes, you say there were some whites that were good to you growing up in the Adirondacks, and I know you write about a couple of your school teachers.
Right.
He wants to know what made them different to be better people. Were they also in groups that were discriminated against, like French Canadians or other ethnic groups, or
Oh,
was there just something about them that
yeah,
made them have different attitudes than many of their peers?
yeah. There was something about uh, all of them that I got to be very close to were not from the area. uh, Mr. Sodas, my favorite teacher, and the one that I, developed a really strong relationship with in school. And once I graduated, he was Greek from New York City. So he had a whole different take on everything. Uh, and the woman that I talk about, Carol Nicholson, uh, she was unbelievable. I don't know I can't remember where she actually came from, but it was a New England state, I think it was. But um, and she traveled and she'd seen a lot of different kinds of people, and she just latched on to me. I mean, I was just amazed. But she was a really good friend, and and there were a couple of other teachers that really were sensitive to what I was going through, and so the teachers were pretty good, basically, So they just didn't know how to. They didn't know about my history as an African, So they couldn't help me with what I was going through. I wanted to know who I was, and they just couldn't help me because they didn't know and I didn't know. So
George Webb wants to know about your parents, and I guess, to preface his question, I was hoping you could tell us a little more about your mother, because I gather she did not have a very easy life.
no, neither one, but I know we have a picture of my parents, which I'm very
Oh yeah,
proud
that's right. If we could share that picture
of.
of Alice's parents.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Uh, Actually, uh, probably my mother was in a family that had a little bit more education than my father. My father was totally illiterate, and so for her, actually, it was things weren't as bad as they were for him. And also him being a male, a black male, which is not the easiest thing to be in the South during that particular period of time. Um, but she was able to get more education. Her grandmother raised her, and I mentioned about my great grandmother. It was her grandmother who actually raised my mother. So that was a real connection to the enslavement experience. Um, Even though my great grandmother, was very little when uh, the Civil War ended, her family stayed on on the plantation, and so she was probably benefited from that because all the other people who were released from the chattel slavery at that time, and we're talking about 4 million people, they had no place to go or anything, they had nothing. So she was lucky in the sense that her grandmother, uh, stayed on the plantation, and she was able um, to marry someone and take care of my mother. Um, but it was, so uh, her family was I think, a little bit better off than my father's because his mother was a sharecropper, and that was, after enslavement, of course, you have sharecropping coming into play, and that was even worse. In many respects, sometimes it was worse than enslavement because you had nothing. Nobody's going to feed you enough, and so. But my mother was a very strong woman. She was gentle. I was very close to her, very, very close to her. And she, wanted me to be a teacher. That was her thing because education was big in her family because, uh, as you know, during the enslavement period, you were not allowed to teach Black people to read or write. And but because her grandmother was able to do better actually on the plantation. Um, I learned about my great great grandmother from her. During the 1930s, there was the Federal Writers Project, which hired people to write different kinds of writing, and one of the things they did was to interview formerly enslaved people because they were all dying off in 1930s, I guess, and so uh, I discovered as I was trying to find out more about my mother and her family, uh, discovered this book that has an interview with my great grandmother. So I was able to learn who my great great
Wow.
grandmother was, my great great uh, uh, my father, not my father, but my mother, my grandfather, great grandfathers, and so I learned a lot more about them than I did about my father. Uh, and so, yeah, she was just very sensitive and caring, and devoted her entire life to making sure her children were safe. And I'm just so lucky that I had her.
Well,
And
and
she
oh, I'm
she
sorry. Go
also
ahead.
did a lot of stuff in terms of the school. She was always at school, making sure that we were okay. My father didn't do that. He felt that his only job was to bring home the bacon or whatever. And so he just worked, and he had that traditional role of just making sure we had what we needed, but he couldn't do that very well either because he was injured in the mines when at a very early age for us, and so he couldn't provide that well. So
Well,
she had,
and I was just going to say, I imagine as someone who had never learned to read nor write, it would have been uncomfortable for him to go to school as well.
right, and he just never felt that was his role,
Right.
and it was, I feel so bad for him because that role got taken away from him when he was run over by a trolley in the mines, and he could no longer work uh, underground, which is where you made the money. And so he had this job, in the what they call the change house, what where people change their clothes to go, into the mines, and made very little money.
Yeah.
Uh, so he felt really defeated. Uh, he did his best, but that, he had nothing to lean on.
Do you have a sense, and I think this is what both George Webb and Alice Berger are getting at in the questions they ask. Do you have a sense for how your parents saw the difference between life in the Jim Crow South and life as one of the few black families in the Adirondacks?
Yeah, that's interesting because one of the things, the reason why I don't know a whole lot about my family is because my parents never wanted to talk to us about their experiences. What I know about them now, I had to learn on my own. They just did, the basic work that had to be done to take care of their children, but they didn't talk about those terrible things that they had experienced in the South. And I only learned about them later, as I said. So I didn't know a whole lot. Every now and then, my dad would get together with a couple of the people from Port Henry who were also from the South, and they would, talk about, some bad experiences, but we sort of had to listen through the wall to hear what they were talking about. But they never wanted to talk about their experiences in the South. Other than the only thing I ever learned was my mother, who had never been out of the South, was willing to come north. Was that she was afraid that her husband would be arrested because the job that he had um, in a mill, he had to walk. I don't know exactly where it is, but had to walk through this area, and every now and then there would be a white woman there, and he would tell her about it, and she was scared to death that, and it happened to so many people. That's why so many people were lynched in the South, as if you, um, uh, looked at a white woman, or she claimed you looked at her. Uh, we had the situation with Emmett Till, which is the only thing that that was a terrible thing that happened, and and my mother, I think, tried to hide it from us, but we saw it in this magazine, and I heard what had happened to him, which scared us all to death. I mean, it took me a long time to go back south, mainly because of what happened to Emmett Till, and so, but they never, they didn't even want to talk to us about that. Um, they protected us.
Um, I was interested. One of the little details you mentioned was that your mom was a committed Brooklyn Dodgers fan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Was
that
it?
was something, like all I knew is, I'm trying to go to sleep. My mother has the radio on. That was her one joy, was to
Uh,
listen to ball games.
uh, I imagine Jackie Robinson had a lot to do with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also, don't forget, we're from Witherby, and Johnny Podgers was with me. That sort of enforced it all, you know. But that was, and the other thing she did, she loved uh Western movies. I grew up on all the Western movies, which is you know, that was the only thing we did together. It basically, in terms of entertainment, was she found a way to get us all to the Port Henry to attend the movies, and so I grew up with that. That's where the acting, or the desire to act, also came from.
We have a question from Nancy Rhodes, who writes, it's been such a pleasure to see and hear you again after many years. Nancy Rhodes from Syracuse, and she says she's looking forward to reading your memoir, and adds, the Common Council just tried to gut our citizen review board, but we convinced the mayor to veto it. She says what you were saying is so important, and I wonder if it's understanding that we have to deal with how things have felt is something we come to later in life. The idea that maybe this was a book that you had to wait until just recently to be able to write because you know yourself better.
Well, that might be true. But as I said, I wasn't planning on writing it because I didn't want to share that. But now I've gotten to the point in my life where I think it's really important for us to understand that all of us, have to know the history of African American people, uh, and the terrible things that happened. You know, as I said, my parents never told us about all the stuff, but uh, you know, I've had friends that I've visited at various times. Their parents were willing to talk about it, the lynchings, you know, and all of that. Uh, and so, you know, it's really tough to deal with those things without having some background and understanding. And so that's why I'm trying to, as I said, we're doing a project at the Center for Law and Justice now to try to develop a program that could be shared with other groups about the history, because you got to know that. If you don't know what Africans have been through in this country, you know, the horrible things and all of that, um, the even the trip to this country, the Middle Passage was unbelievable, where you throw people off into the Atlantic Ocean if they were sick, because they weren't of value. And so, you know, and there are millions of Africans that were buried in the Atlantic Ocean because they got thrown overboard. And so it's things like that that people don't understand. And we sort of judge what's happening in the African American community based on, you know, statistics and the things that are happening that, you know, we talk about in criminal justice, crime and criminal justice and all of this, without understanding how Africans Americans have been deprived of so much in this country, like housing. Housing discrimination is a major thing. And education, if you don't, you know, you don't get a good education if you don't live in an area where you own your home. You know, medical care, where we were, you know, experiments were carried out on both men and women. There's just a whole slew of things that people don't understand. So you can't look at me and say, you know, something's wrong with you. Uh, and it took me a long time to realize, no, that's not what it is. There was a great deal of harm that was done to Africans throughout this period. Uh, and we're still, you know, experiencing a lot of it. And the gaps between whites and blacks are incredible. And just looking at the stats with home ownership or income, you know, vast difference. Disproportionate incarceration is another factor. So, yeah, I want people to understand and to feel.
Yeah, I imagine there must be people out there whose view of race in the region in the mid 20th century as being along the lines of, well, if there weren't crosses being burned on lawns, it must have been an okay place to grow up as a black person. And it seems like what you're doing is really trying to educate people about what it felt like to be you and experience what you experienced.
Yes, absolutely. Because someone said to me, writers that I was doing something with a little while ago, and I was talking about the Middle Passage, which was horrible, and the the writer said, "Well, at least there were those who survived." But it's a traumatic experience. She didn't get that. It's a traumatic experience that didn't end right there. And we have all of these traumatic experiences where we don't get therapy and care. Uh, when something horrible happens, and as you probably noticed, like if a kid, for instance, gets killed or something in an accident, uh, people will say, "Oh, we got to have therapists at the school to make sure these kids can handle that." Well, we had so many of those, lynchings and all of those things where there was no therapy. It happened and it gets handed down. It doesn't end at that, particular time. So you have to understand that. And so that you'll understand, there's the project, the 1619 project, which says, if you really want to understand where we are today, you have to clearly see the past. And I believe that so strongly because I know the harm, the impact, the trauma that's a part of my history in this country. And I want people to understand that.
There's a question that Steve Stoffolano asks about how your parents arrived in Witherby, and I guess I want to pair it with a question that I have because this place where you grew up, it was never a really large place,
Yeah.
but it has really diminished in size in the
Yeah.
last few decades.
Yeah.
When you go back today, how do you feel about Witherby? How do you kind of reconcile this, this challenging time you had growing up with the idea that even so this was still your hometown?
Yeah, that's an interesting one too, and very difficult for me. I'm gonna tell you right now, uh, because I have I have so many uh, memories that the thing with my parents, for instance, I uh, when my parents needed me and I was graduated from college and I wanted to go back and take care of them and work uh, and teach. And I applied for a job at the high school, and I was told that people were too familiar with me. Well, I don't understand that, but because somebody else had graduated too and got a job, and she was a year ahead of me. So, uh, there were things like that bothered me. Uh, there was a lot of pain, the loss of my brother, um, the difficulties with my dad and all of that. Um, and when they died like 11 weeks apart, it was so painful for me to think about Witherby that I didn't go back for a long time. And then after a few years, my brothers and sisters decided we would go and we would have like a reunion in Witherby uh, during the holiday, July 4th. And we did that for a while, but it still was not the same. It was painful. And so right now, I rarely go to Witherby. Uh, because I still feel a great deal of pain. Luckily, my husband has a place in Essex, so we go to Essex, but it's rare that I will go to Witherby, and it's a different place. And uh, we did do a gathering 2 years ago up in Essex, and we invited people from ones I could get in touch with from Witherby to come and talk about. I wanted to talk about that experience because they didn't understand or know what we were experiencing. And so I did try that. Um, and it was okay, but I couldn't get enough people to do it the way I wanted to do it because they just didn't respond. And but I want, every time I see them or have contact, I found myself wanting to explain to them how I felt, because you didn't understand how I felt. And I think it's important that you do. And that's when, as I said, one of them said, we were considered outsiders, and therefore we were different. And so it continues to be a painful experience for me.
Uh, Cindy, and I think it's Trice is her last name, asks whether you think there's been the same amount of change in the Adirondacks versus the city as far as the way Black people are treated by other races. And I guess maybe the bigger question is how much change do you see in the Adirondacks of today, even when you just go and maybe spend time in Essex versus the Adirondacks that you remember as a child.
Well, still, you don't see very many people of color. That's one thing. So that hasn't changed a whole lot, but there is interest in, I mean, there are some groups up there that are working on social justice stuff, like the John Brown Lives and the Underground Railroad, and some other programs, diversity programs. Uh, but sometimes I worry about that to some extent, because it I know that a lot of people wanted to diversify up in the Adirondacks because they were afraid that state wouldn't provide as much resources to maintain the Adirondacks in its purity. I know that they did that because that's the first time I got involved with them. And of course, the Adirondack still has prisons. Luckily, some of them have closed. Uh, and it's always been difficult because people, I used to go to Plattsburgh area, and people thought I must be a family member of someone who's in prison, because why else would you be up here, kind of thing. And and other people that I know have had some experiences, being called the N-word in that area. But there are more people there, so which is good, and there's more interest in learning about the history, as I said, because of the groups that I just mentioned are doing a good job of teaching. So it's different, I think, now, because the world around has changed. Like, I don't think it's as bad as in terms of like interracial relationships. That seems, I see a number of them up in the Adirondacks. There's still not a lot, but I worry that we are so focused on diversity and what that means, um, and inclusion, whatever that means, that we don't really think about how you really accept people. You got to think of me as human, first of all. If you think I'm slightly less than human, you can talk about diversity all day. You can talk about equity and inclusion all day, but we still have that uh, the way we view people is still there, in terms of accepting you for who you are. I want you to, I have so many people tell me that when I go, well, I don't see color. And I, that bothers me so much, because why, how could you not see my color? I want you to see my color. It's okay, but I want you to say that person happens to be Black, but that person is another person. That's all I want. And I think people are having such great difficulty doing that. They talk about, wanting to have equity and justice, but because we have spent so much time in this country dehumanizing Black people, that it's so hard for so many to do that. They're nice people, they do nice things, but they also don't think of me as an equal. And if you don't think of me as an equal, you haven't made a whole lot of progress. Okay. And so I try to get that message. And a lot of people don't like me to talk about that, but I see it as being real, that you know, and I spent time with people who've gone up there who to visit people who are incarcerated, you know, and I know what they've experienced. And it hasn't been pretty. Um, you know, before they call it the African Queen bus that brings Black people up there. You know, things like that. You know, it's still there, but it's getting it. You know, there's some good people, and I'm hoping that if they can at least understand what they need to know about me, and then they can accept me with compassion and understanding and equity. You know, I want you to see me, this Black woman, who's just equal to you.
Um, we have a couple of questions, one from Anthony and one from George, that I think are related. Anthony writes, I assume that most African American youth growing up in the Adirondacks after they graduated high school left the region more often for a better life elsewhere. Is that so? And if so, where did they go and for what reasons? And then George Webb asks whether your siblings left the area and what they did for a living.
Yeah. Well, yes, the boy that I write about in the book that was close to the other Black family, he said, the minute I graduate, I am leaving this town. And he did it. The minute he graduated, he hopped on the train and he left. He went to Detroit. So that did happen. Most of the people in Port Henry, just about everybody's gone from Port Henry. They left as soon as they could. So you know, so that definitely was true. My brothers, I'm so proud of my brothers and my family. My sister became a nurse, worked in emergency room at Harlem Hospital, uh, and my brother Ralph, who was the athlete. uh, as a matter of fact, he has a stadium
Yeah.
that's now named after him. He was incredible. They just loved him, absolutely loved him. And my brother William Duke, they call him Duke. You know, he also got into medicine. You know, and he lives in Hyde Park right now. Um, he's not well, but he lives in Hyde Park. And uh, and I have a sister who lives out in Rochester. We've all done good things in our lives, and I, attribute that to being fortunate to have the parents that I had, and some of the people I met along the way who were really nice, like some of the teachers. Uh,
Um, Alice Berger writes, what do you think is meaningful political action to further true change? I mean, I guess that maybe the bigger question is what do you think would make the biggest difference in creating a region that is truly accepting of people regardless of their race or other background?
mhm. Well, that's what I'm struggling with right now, as I
Yeah.
said before. I just going back, and I talk about this all the time because people don't know the history, you know, and if you don't know the history and understand the trauma and understand uh, the impact of it all, including white supremacy, you're never going to commit yourself to the kind of actions uh, that are going to make a difference. So I also tell people, look at what you do. Um, a lot of people do good things. I mean, I'm not blasting them on that. They do some good things, that help people in a certain situation. But examine some of those things that you do. Ask yourself, does that in any way repair the harm that's been done? And so I'm big right now on reparations. New York State just passed a reparations a law that will create a reparations commission, and they're going to look at and examine the damage that's been done. And there's a lot of damage that's been done that I don't think a lot of people understand. okay? What's happened with our children and all of that, because we're also traumatized. And so I think for me, that's the first step. You got to know what I've been through. And then if you can feel it, and I think that's when you do things that will, will make the difference, because it's not just saying, I'm all for this or I'm all for that, or I have black friends and and all of that. That's nice, but it doesn't make a difference if you're not willing to go out there and make sure that uh, Africans are African Americans are seen as human beings and need to be treated the way everybody else is. I'm not asking for anything, so outrageous that I'm just saying, hey, here I am, take me as I am, and treat me that way. And if we can do that with people, then I think, there's no quick answer, uh, and we have to start doing that.
That doesn't sound outrageous at all.
No.
Uh, I guess I just have one more question. I know we're running low on time, but there are some books on Black history in the Adirondacks. There's Sally Svensson's book, a couple we have talked about in this series of interviews by Amy Godine and one by Brian Thompson. But what histories do you hope someone will still write about one day?
Well, again, I've had this discussion with other writers. I did do something in Sally Svensson's book. I did an epilogue on that. And I'm hoping that, again, I'm hoping that when people write, that they not just, sometimes we write and we think we're writing about Black people and we're not. And I've been reading some books where, we still end up glorifying, and not say that they shouldn't be, but we don't write about the experiences of Black people. We sort of gloss over that, and we talk about other people who had some relationship with them or something like that. But I think people need to know the struggles and the pain so they'll understand. Right now in this country, we're seen as people who are, steeped in poverty, had nothing to contribute, you know, and many people see that we're inclined to be criminal and all of that, because you don't know us and you don't know the history. And so you can write a nice book about it, but if I can't see something in that book that tells me and educates other people about the struggle and why we're in the situation we're in right now, then it's not of value to me.
Well, Dr. Alice Paden Green, I truly want to thank you for helping us at least begin to feel what you felt, and you're being willing to share your experiences with us. And it really has been an honor to spend this hour with you. And I'm going to turn things over to David Kahn.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Alice and Mitch, for that really rich conversation. Really appreciate it, and I know our viewers did as well. And many thanks to the people who joined us for this evening's conversation. This is the last in this season's programs in the Adirondack series, but we'll be back in the fall, and Mitch will be with us. So keep an eye out for announcement on our website and emails that we'll be sending out to folks. And please join us for in-person programs at the Adirondack Experience. These will begin on Monday, July 1, here at the Experience. And the first speaker will be the artist Ingrid Van Slick. For more information about events in general at the Experience, please go to adkx.org/events. So that's it for the evening. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope we'll see everybody at the Adirondack Experience this summer. We're open every day, 10 to 5. Thanks so much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.